In our second year of high school, Julia, a student who had always been supported by my childhood friend Eric, transferred to our school. She was plain, unrefined, and shy, but there was a cautious affection for Eric hidden in her eyes. Everyone at school laughed at her wishful thinking and kindly reminded me, "Zoe, be careful. Eric getting involved with Julia is like getting stuck with glue. Once it's on you, it's impossible to shake off." Having someone like that hovering around your childhood friend every day must be incredibly irritating. Yeah, Zoe, it's not about fearing a thief stealing, but fearing a thief always eyeing your stuff. One day, you'll end up losing to Julia. Chapter 01. The person who warned me with these words seemed to find it absurd even as they said it. So they added, "But it's impossible. Really, who would choose Julia over you? You'd have to be out of your mind." I didn't respond. Eric and I were childhood friends, perfectly matched in every way. He was a natural-born prodigy, always adored by everyone, and I was the school beauty, well-off, intelligent, and talented. In everyone's eyes, Eric and I were the perfect pair. But who was Julia? She was a poor student Eric sponsored, who came from a remote rural area. She was plain, round-faced, with dry hair due to malnutrition, and there wasn't a single admirable quality about her. Perhaps in a romance novel, this would be the beginning of an inspiring and romantic love story. But unfortunately, this was real life. However, Julia never hid her feelings for Eric. It started with her first appearance at our school, her rural appearance, her rural clothing, and the 2 huge burlap sacks she was carrying caught everyone's attention. She looked entirely out of place in our school, which attracted even more stares, especially when she dragged those 2 huge sacks over to Eric. When she opened them, they were filled with farm products, fresh eggs, peanuts, corn, melons, apples. She lifted her face and smiled at Eric, looking at him like he was a god, focused and reverent. She said, "Brother Eric, these are from my parents for you. They're all grown on our farm, very fresh. My mom said that farm produce in the city is all treated with chemicals. It's not healthy. Thank you for taking care of me all these years." That one statement sent waves throughout the school. It wasn't just the farm produce, there were also her words. Brother Eric and all these years of care. Those vague remarks were bound to make people speculate. Everyone's eyes naturally turned to the 2 of them. Ears perked up. Probably. That was when everyone who told me to be wary of Julia started disliking her. They all thought Julia was a scheming, pretentious coquette. Although they didn't believe Julia could steal Eric away from me, they still enthusiastically reminded me, "Zoe, you're too kind, and you let your guard down too easily. Don't be fooled by how pitiful Julia looks. People like her can be really nasty when they want to be. Yeah, just look at those TV dramas. There are plenty of times where plain-looking nannies steal the husbands from the wives. It's not about fearing a thief who steals once, but fearing a thief who keeps coveting what's yours. Every time." I would smile and nod, considering it a gesture of accepting their nearly well-intentioned warnings. That day, Eric probably hadn't expected Julia's gratitude to be such a grand affair. His gaze moved from the bags in front of Julia to her face, his expression cold and indescribably complicated. In the end, he politely declined. "No need. I don't eat these things. Thanks." Then, without looking at Julia again, he turned his head to me and said, "Zoe, let's go." After walking a few steps alongside Eric, I turned back to look. Julia was looking down at the 2 burlap sacks that had been rejected. I couldn't see her expression, nor could I tell what she was thinking. After a long moment, she picked up the 2 heavy bags and turned to leave with difficulty. There were people all around, but no one went to help her. Everyone looked at her with a mix of surprise and well-concealed disdain. She was so out of place here. I don't know why, but watching her struggling back, I suddenly felt a little sorry for her. Chapter 02. Eric's rejection didn't discourage Julia. Every morning after that, Julia would place a spicy tofu bun, which required waiting in line for a long time at the school gate, and a cup of soy milk on Eric's desk. That spicy tofu bun was made from a secret recipe by the shop owner, and even the elderly residents from the nearby apartments would come to queue for it. Every morning it would sell out early, meaning Julia had to get up really early to get it. The thought behind it was touching, but unfortunately, Because both Erick and I had farms at home. All our meals were made from organic ingredients and paired by certified national-level nutritionists. At first, Erick tried to communicate with Julia. He found her eating corn on the cob, brought it from home to save money, and gently told her, "You don't need to do these things anymore. I really don't need it." Julia looked at Erick with soft eyes, nodding continuously. But the next day, there was still breakfast on Erick's desk. Eventually, Erick gave up. He handed the breakfast to a classmate in front of him and casually said, "Let her do whatever she wants." It was probably because of this that many people in the school grew more and more annoyed with Julia. The turning point came in the third week of the semester. During the second week, we had an essay assignment to write about the person who had the greatest impact on you during your life or growing up. Many people wrote about Stephen Hawking, Eileen Chang, Elon Reeve Musk, in short, all kinds of celebrities. Julia wrote about Erick. Her writing was very good, and her emotions were genuine. In her essay, she described the conditions of girls in her remote mountainous area, and how Erick's support changed her life. She wrote that if it weren't for Erick's financial support, she might have already married the butcher from the neighboring village. In the end, she wrote her gratitude for Erick, describing how much effort she had put in to meet the benefactor who changed the trajectory of her life and to bring those two burlap sacks that everyone else despised to him. In the last paragraph, she wrote, "Erick, you probably don't know how far I've traveled, how much I've endured, just to stand in front of you. Everyone has an idol they revere, but you are the hero who changed my life. You are my hero." This essay moved our language teacher to tears and stood out as the best essay, largely because it covered many aspects and had numerous points that could be promoted: the current situation of poor students in mountainous areas, the girl who made it out of the mountains, quality education development at our high school. Of course, these reviews were formed among the teachers. We eventually learned about the essay in the third week. On Monday, during a school-wide student assembly, when the teacher asked Julia to read her essay aloud, it was obvious that she was very nervous. She read it with a lot of stuttering, but when she reached the final paragraph, her gaze carried a hint of thin tears, and then it passed through the crowd, landing directly on Erick, who was standing next to me. She said, "Erick, you are my hero." I saw Erick's body stiffen. His eyes met Julia's on the stage, but I could only see the side of his face, not the emotions in his eyes. Whether this essay moved Erick, I couldn't say, but it did move some of the people who had previously disliked Julia. Oh my gosh, I was moved to tears. Me too, even though she always looked quiet and seemed like she had a lot of hidden intentions. It was actually touching. If Erick hadn't helped her, she would have had a really tough life. Yeah, it's understandable to fall for the person who saved you in a situation like that. It feels like we've been too harsh on her. True. Oh my. I'm even starting to hope she gets together with Erick. I know it's wrong, but Zoe already has everything. She's got the family, the looks, the grades, the popularity. But Julia, she only has Erick. This is like a fairy tale of salvation. Wake up. Gratitude is one thing, but this essay is an outright love letter, especially when everyone knows Zoe is Erick's girlfriend. Julia may come from a backward family, but she's certainly not behind in manipulation and pretentious coquette tactics. I walked past these murmurs without changing my expression, and standing by the door, listening all this time, Julia smiled at me. This was actually the first time I'd seen her smile at me, other than when she was in front of Erick. She always wore a silent and reserved look in front of everyone else. Honestly, I didn't dislike Julia. There was a kind of tenacity about this quiet girl. Even though this tenacity had infringed upon my territory, I still admired her for having a clear goal and for her unwavering efforts toward it. I don't dislike people who work hard for their life and goals. She looked at me, almost as if reminding me, and said word by word, "Zoe, they're not wrong about me. My intentions aren't pure." She paused, then continued, "I'm here for Erick." I paused and turned my head to look at her indifferently. I smiled, showing no particular emotion, and softly asked, almost regretfully, "Really? I thought you were here for education." This was our first confrontation. Chapter 03. I didn't tell Erick about my little exchange with Julia. To me, it was just an insignificant matter. The first time I truly took a good look at Julia was shortly afterward. One afternoon, my family was hosting guests, and Erick and I were too impatient to deal with them. So we stayed at school and didn't go home. When Erick and I returned to the classroom after lunch, we saw that the large classroom only had Julia sitting there all alone. She was bent over, pressing on her stomach. It seemed she was feeling unwell. She looked up when she heard the noise. Her gaze fell from Erick to me. Then she pressed her lips together and looked back down. Erick followed my gaze and frowned slightly. But he didn't say anything, just turned to me and said, "Zoe, I'll be back in a minute." After he left, I stood there, frowning, and looked at Julia again, asking her, "Are you okay?" She looked up. It was obvious she didn't really want to talk to me, but ignoring someone showing concern would have been a bit impolite. So she gave me a weak shake of her head. I paused, then let it go. Not long after, Erick returned with 2 cups of milk tea and a box of cake. I've never been interested in cake, so Erick handed me one of the cups of milk tea, then took the remaining cup and the box of cake over to Julia's desk, placing them in front of her. The classroom was empty and quiet, so the sound was very clear. I heard Erick say to Julia, "Stop saving money to buy me breakfast. You should be eating more yourself." Julia looked up at Erick. I could see her stunned expression, but she didn't say anything. Instead, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Erick, as if she were a traveler halfway through a long and arduous journey, or someone about to die of thirst in the desert who had suddenly found an oasis within reach. That look made Erick pause. And then he explained, "Why do you have that expression? Don't overthink it. I just don't want you to get sick from saving money to buy me breakfast." Erick's eyes and expression were open and sincere. Julia's gaze quickly dimmed with disappointment, but she soon smiled at him and said, "Thank you, Erick." Erick nodded politely, then walked back to sit beside me, asking, "Zoe, where do you want to go this week?" I looked at Erick. I believed that Erick's concern for Julia was just out of camaraderie, a simple act of helping one another. Maybe it was because of the family atmosphere, and him being an only child, with countless people fawning over him from a young age. That made him grow into someone indifferent and distant to others. But no matter what, deep down, he was always very kind. I thought for a moment and replied, "Let's go see that stand-up comedian we both like." Erick smiled at me and said, "Then I'll get the tickets in advance." He placed his hand on the back of mine, warmth spreading from his palm. He looked at me with a gentle smile, so I smiled back at him. Chapter 04. The workload in our second year of high school was becoming heavier, and the much-watched drama involving Erick, Julia, and me gradually faded. It was like a play that began with a climax, and every moment thereafter failed to keep the audience on the edge of their seats, leading the onlookers to lose interest. This drama stirred again when someone found Julia's notebook. They opened it and saw page after page filled with Erick's name. The cake Erick had bought for her that day. After she finished it, she had carefully pressed the packaging into her notebook like a cherished treasure. Even though Julia followed Erick and me every day, even though she never said outright that she liked Erick, her crush on him was common knowledge. But this was the first time her girlish feelings were laid bare for everyone to see. It had been quite a while since Julia wrote her essay. People are forgetful, and they had already forgotten how the essay had moved them. Once again ridiculing Julia's unrealistic dreams, they all said Julia was a toad wishing for swan meat. By the time Erick and I heard about it, Julia's notebook, filled with Erick's name, had already been passed around. Someone asked Erick right in front of Julia, "How do you feel about being secretly admired by such an ugly duckling? Isn't it disgusting?" Someone else asked me, "Zoe, doesn't it make you sick to have someone like Julia hanging around you and Erick all day pretending to be harmless? You must feel disgusted too, right?" Honestly, these questions were annoying. They pretended to stand in solidarity with me, acting as if they were confiding in me sincerely. But really, they just wanted to see the drama unfold. I smiled silently at the person who asked, and they got the hint and shut up. Even if I had any feelings about it, it wasn't anyone else's business to comment on. Erick also tried his best to protect a young girl's self-esteem and her youthful dreams. He looked at the person asking, his expression growing colder, and said, "If you don't know how to speak properly, you could donate your mouth to someone who needs it." After that, no one brought up the matter to us again. The next day, Erick arrived at the classroom quite early. When Julia placed breakfast on his desk, Erick looked at her and said gently, "Julia, could you come outside with me for a moment?" Julia froze, glancing at me. I said nothing, and she followed Erick out of the classroom. No one knew what they talked about, but when they returned, Julia's eyes were red. After that, she stopped showing up around Erick and me. I didn't ask Erick what he said to Julia. It was an unspoken understanding between us, and since it concerned another girl's privacy, I wouldn't pry. Chapter 05. I found out the content of that conversation after the college entrance exams. It was probably the last time I saw Julia during our youth. She had changed a lot from when I first met her. She was thinner, her hair no longer dry from malnutrition, and she had a quiet and mature presence about her. She came to me holding her university acceptance letter, asking if I could do her a favor. She wanted me to tell Erick that she had gotten into college. It was a pretty good university, and compared to the fate she would have had marrying the butcher next door at just 16, it was already like defying destiny. I sincerely congratulated her and asked, "Why don't you tell him yourself?" Julia smiled, and I saw the self-mockery in her eyes. She said, "Erick told me that day he hopes I won't disturb you two again." I looked at her, and for some reason, I asked her to join me for a steak dinner. When I first took Julia to the restaurant, she probably thought I was trying to humiliate her, because we both knew she had likely never been to a place like that before. Perhaps out of a sense of defiance, she sat across from me in silence, trying to imitate how I held the utensils. But her knife and fork made a harsh scraping noise against the plate. I took them from her and showed her how to cut the steak. I looked up at her, giving her a gentle smile that must have been different from what she had expected from me if she thought I wanted to humiliate her. I said, "Julia, congratulations on your new life. This meal is my gift to you." Erick gave her a new beginning, and I was willing to offer her a small gift for her new life as well. These were things no one had taught her during her upbringing. I talked to her about relationships and social interactions for when she went to university, taught her how to get along with others, recommended books on etiquette and social interactions, and suggested that she try to gain as much new knowledge about the world as possible, whether through extensive reading or even her phone, with the lowest cost, compared to textbook knowledge like math or chemistry. These things would help her expand her social circle and transform herself more quickly, because in the end, all learning eventually boils down to constantly dealing with different people. And people, most people, see the value in you first before deciding how deeply to engage with you. As much as everyone longs for pure and uncomplicated relationships, the truth is that appearances often come first for most people. This was my blessing for her as she embarked on her new journey. Finally, I smiled at her and said, "Julia, I wish you the best in your new life." She listened intently, and it wasn't until this moment that she looked up at me. Her expression was complex, and just as I thought she was about to thank me, she suddenly said, "Zoe, do you think you're really kind?" I paused, stunned. A faint layer of tears quickly welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She just stubbornly looked at me and asked, "Do you know what Erick told me when he called me out that day?" Her gaze turned to the void as she spoke. "Erick told me that he was just helping out a poor student out of boredom. It could have been anyone, it just happened to be me." Julia, he told me not to see this as some kind of salvation fairy tale. He told me not to pin unrealistic hopes on him. He said he was sorry, but he would always only like you. You see, Zoe, I don't even have the right to dream about a crush. She turned her gaze back to me, her expression pitiful as she looked at me. "You spent time today taking me out to eat and teaching me all these things, and now I react like this. You must think I'm ungrateful, right?" I frowned slightly. She continued, "But how am I supposed to be grateful to you?" In my eyes, today's gift was nothing more than a condescending charity from someone rich. You never really took me seriously, because you knew I wasn't qualified. You never mocked or ridiculed my crush, never sneered at me, because you knew that you, and Erick, were not from the same world. That's why you're gentle, kind, and willing to tell me these things. But I'd rather you were arrogant, boastful, and proud. I know many people laugh at me for not knowing my place, for being foolish. But what did I do wrong, Zoe? I was just hopelessly, foolishly in love with someone I could never deserve. I'm more aware of this than anyone, but that love pushes me forward, makes me want to become a better version of myself. Her tears finally fell. She said to me, "Zoe, I don't think I ever told you, but I really hate that condescending attitude of yours. I suggest you don't be too nice to me. Someday, I'll become your rival." She stood up, looking down at me. The dazzling crystal chandelier above her illuminated everything, making her expressions clear and unhidden. She looked at me and smiled. She said, "Zoe, today you taught me a lot, and now I'll teach you something. Some people, like me, are ungrateful wolves. No matter how much you feed them, they will never be tamed." Chapter 06. After that day, Julia disappeared. I mentioned to Erick that Julia had been accepted into university. He smiled, as if genuinely happy for her, and asked me, "Zoe, did I change a girl's destiny?" I smiled and nodded. Erick and I got into different universities, but luckily, they were both in the same city, even within the same university town. When I first moved into the dormitory and was getting to know my new roommates, one of them marveled at my childhood bond with Erick. They envied the steady relationship between Erick and me. Of course, rather than calling it steady, it might be more accurate to say it was natural by habit. Erick and I had grown up together, and during the age when love blossoms, we were seen as the most compatible couple by everyone, including our parents, who had paved the way for us from an early age. Our being together felt like the natural course of things. If nothing unexpected happened, we would get married 2 or 3 years after graduating from university. Erick would take over the company under his father's arrangement, and I would learn to help manage the company's affairs. This was supposed to be the most natural thing. The unexpected happened in the second half of our senior year. Of course, there was never any outsider between Erick and me. Both of us were people with strong boundaries and a strong sense of cleanliness. In the words of my roommate, Erick and I were pure love warriors who didn't match our appearances. But when I went home during the second half of our senior year, I suddenly felt lost. This sense of uncertainty began with a conversation between my family and Erick's family. Erick and I were about to graduate, and our families were discussing whether we should continue our studies abroad or come back and take over the family business. By the end of the discussion, somehow, the conversation shifted to what would happen after Erick and I got married. Of course, this was meant as a joke by the elders. But even jokes carried their expectations for Erick's and my future. Erick's mother said that we shouldn't go abroad and that it would be best if we started planning for marriage a year after graduation. A year later, Erick and I would have a cute child. According to my mother, it would be best if we had 3 children, 2 boys, one to take Erick's surname and inherit his family's business, and one to take my surname and take over my family's company. Finally, we would have a little girl, the youngest sister, who would be cherished by everyone. By the end of the conversation, everyone was laughing. My mother and Erick's mother were so excited that they made plans to go to the mall that afternoon to look at baby clothes. As if I were already married and pregnant, I took a can of fruit wine and walked away alone. Sitting on the swing in the garden, watching the sunset, the evening glow looked like orange, pale pink, and crimson purple paint spilled across a palette, blending together. After a while, Erick came over to find me. I turned my head to glance at him. He didn't say anything, just walked over and sat beside me, then asked, "What's wrong?" I paused for a moment before saying, "Erick, I feel really scared." He turned his head, looking at me silently. I knew he had sensed my unease while the elders were chatting. He had given me a moment alone before coming over to check on me. He's always been so considerate. I looked at the sunset. The sky that was once full of mixed colors visibly darkening before my eyes. The orange, pale pink, and crimson purple were slowly turning into a dark indigo. I spoke softly to Erick. "Once I was my family's daughter. In a year I'll be your wife. And a year after that I'll be the mother of your child." I turned my head to look at Erick. He had been listening quietly all along, and I looked at him, asking sadly, "But Erick, who am I really? I'm a little scared." He got down and knelt in front of me, looking up at me in the dusk. His eyes shone brightly. He took my hand and said, "Don't be afraid, Zoe. If you don't want to get married yet, we won't. If you don't want children, We won't have them. We'll find the answer together. I squeezed his hand back, the unease in my heart gradually fading away. Erick understands me. I've lived my life for over 20 years according to everyone else's expectations. I don't want to accept the neatly laid out path. The prospect of spending the next several decades in a life of being a dutiful wife and mother. I look from now toward the rest of my life, at the road that was laid out for me practically since my teenage years, leading all the way to old age. I feel a sense of despair. Chapter 07. Time passed in the blink of an eye. When we graduated in our senior year, Erick and I planned our graduation trip to Africa. Before our departure, an issue suddenly arose with a business order for Erick's family. Erick's uncle suggested that Erick take the opportunity to gain some experience. I couldn't help much by staying in the country, and since we had already booked all our hotels, I ended up going abroad alone so as not to waste the trip. This moment marked a change in my fate, Erick's, and even Julia's, who would later be pulled into it all again. Though we knew nothing of it at the time, I fell in love with the vast, boundless savanna. From South Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe to Tanzania, Zambia, I fell in love with the resilience and vitality of life on that land. Much later, I became known among all my classmates as a legend, though not necessarily in a good way. Everyone spoke of me with regret, because Zoe, who had always excelled in everything, suddenly seemed to snap after graduation. She went to Africa, joined a wildlife conservation organization, and became a volunteer for animal protection. My parents couldn't accept my decision. They asked me, "Zoe, what's the point of it all? You're a pampered girl, exhausting yourself every day, climbing mountains and wading through rivers. What is it all for? For what?" Honestly, I wasn't quite sure myself. It was just that the highlands, the dawns, the crisp and fresh air seemed almost tangible there. I saw millions of flamingos, rhinos, elephants, giraffes, cheetahs, hippos, lions. I also saw elephants with their ivory tusks brutally hacked off, rhinos with their horns forcibly removed, and the bodies of animals strewn across the savanna, casualties of poaching and hunting. Humans always call themselves the most intelligent of all beings, but I think that's an extremely anthropocentric view. The Earth doesn't belong to humans alone. Billions of living beings share the same planet. Yet humans, armed with technology and tools, kill them with impunity. I've seen elephants circling a young elephant's corpse for hours, refusing to leave. I've also seen a lioness howling beside the body of her mate, killed by poachers, before deciding to become a volunteer. I saved a monkey that had been abused by tourists. It recovered its health at the rescue center. When I went to see it before I left, it placed a banana in my hand, blinking its dark, wet eyes at me as if telling me to eat it. Due to abuse and prolonged starvation, it almost never had enough to eat and would devour food the moment it found any. That banana, it had secretly saved it for me. I cannot put into words how shocked I felt at that moment. Compared to the many faces of humans, animals seem more honest and real. It was at that moment that I made the sudden decision. When that thought boiled through every inch of my blood, I finally felt like I was truly experiencing the meaning of life. I thought, I want to do something I really love, so I went ahead and did it. Of course, it faced a lot of opposition. It was Erick who stood by me against all objections. He said to me, "Go for it, Zoe, as long as you love it." My family had no choice but to temporarily compromise, though a large part of that compromise was because they thought this was just a passing whim. During my 3rd month as a volunteer, my family grew uneasy. They hadn't expected me to persist for so long. They likely assumed I couldn't endure the hardship and would soon change my mind. Erick and I started our first ever long-distance relationship. After graduation, Erick slowly began taking over the family business. He was busy, and I was busy too. Sometimes, out on the savannah, there wasn't always a signal. We could only have video calls late, very late at night. Sometimes, while we were talking, I would get so tired I'd fall asleep, and when I woke up, I'd see that he had also fallen asleep on the other end, still holding his phone. But neither of us could bring ourselves to end the video call. Every once in a while, he'd ask me if I needed any supplies and send them to me, across thousands of miles. In the 4th month, despite his busy schedule, Erick flew to Serengeti to find me. He brought me lots of things, and we hugged at sunset. He lifted me up and spun me around. I buried my head in his chest, quietly listening to his heartbeat, and it felt like everything around us had come to a peaceful halt in that moment. Erick asked, "Zoe, are you happy?" I softly hummed in agreement. I took him to see the animals I had rescued. A Rupel starling flew over and landed on my shoulder, its blue-purple feathers shimmering in the sunlight as it curiously observed Erick beside me. I stayed very still, not daring to move, for fear of scaring it away. Erick's voice was also gentle as he whispered to me, "Can I touch it?" I smiled and replied softly, "You can try." He reached out carefully, stopping just short of the Rupel's starling. The bird looked at him, then stretched its neck, tilting its head as it brushed its beak against his fingertips. Before Erick could express his surprise, the bird spread its wings and flew away with a sudden flap. Erick's gaze followed it until it disappeared from sight. Then he turned to look at me and sighed, saying, "Honestly, Zoe, I've always supported you, but I never really understood why you made this choice. But now, I think I kind of get it." I smiled and asked, "Did my parents say anything when you came this time?" His expression was calm, giving nothing away, and he said, "No, nothing." Erick stayed with me for a week. He had a lot of responsibilities back home and couldn't stay long. I accompanied him to Zanzibar for a 2-day holiday. It wasn't until he flew back from Zanzibar that I started feeling reluctant to part with him. He stroked my head and said, "Zoe, I'm always here." Later, I found out that Erick had actually come at my mother's request. She hoped Erick could bring me back home, but when Erick returned, he told her, "Zoe seems very happy. Auntie, we can't take away her happiness." My mom sighed on the other end of the phone and said, with a bit of sadness in her voice, "Do you think I don't want you to do what you love?" She hesitated, then added, "Erick is a good boy. You're in a long-distance relationship now. Do you know how many women are waiting for their chance with him? He's a good boy for 1 year, 2 years, even 3 years. I believe he'll stay loyal to you. But, Zoe, distance is the biggest enemy of love." I paused, stunned, as if to prove her words. The next year, something happened to Erick. Chapter 08. During that period, I was very busy. My friends and I established a rescue foundation, and so Erick and I hadn't been in contact for a long time. Later, we received an honorary certificate from the local government. On the day we received the certificate, I excitedly sent a message to Erick, but there was no reply for a long time. He's probably busy, I thought at the time. It wasn't until the evening, when he still hadn't replied, that I began to feel something was wrong. I called my mom, and she said, "Erick was in a car accident. It happened 2 weeks ago. We didn't tell you because we didn't want you to worry." I stood on the grasslands, holding my phone, and felt my heart grow colder and colder, as if the entire world was spinning. But then, my mom continued, "It's okay. Just his arm and leg are fractured, nothing too serious." I didn't really hear anything she said after that. I hung up and immediately started looking for the nearest flight. I felt oddly calm. I calmly booked my ticket, calmly packed my things, and then asked a friend to drive me to the airport. At the airport, I got a call back from Erick. He was trying to sound normal. In the past, I might have missed it, but now I could hear the weakness in his voice. He laughed and congratulated me. "Zoe, congratulations." I replied with a soft mem, then asked him, "Why didn't you tell me?" The line fell silent. I said, "I'll land tomorrow." "Erick, I'm coming back," he finally said. "I'll send someone to pick you up then." After hanging up, I realized my hands were trembling. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. I had intended to sleep on the plane, but my worry kept me awake, and I stayed that way until I landed. Upon landing, I saw the person Erick had sent to pick me up. I hadn't expected that person to be Julia. After so many years, it was the first time I saw Julia again. In fact, when I first got off the plane, I didn't recognize her. She had changed a lot. Her long, curly chestnut hair no longer looked dry and malnourished. She was much slimmer, with delicate makeup that made her stand out. But what had changed the most was her demeanor. The old Julia, although always quiet, had an air of constant unease about her. Now, she stood confidently at the airport gate, smiling at me in the crowd, waving at me, and calling out, not loudly but clearly, "Miss Zoe, over here." I assumed she was Erick's new assistant, until she took my suitcase and asked with a smile, "Zoe, didn't you recognize me?" I looked at her again. She was smiling, looking me in the eyes, examining my reaction as if out of curiosity, and said, "I'm Julia." I paused for just a moment before quickly giving her a polite smile and saying, "It's you. Long time no see." She looked at me for 2 seconds, then turned her gaze away and said, "Long time no see." Since I had so much on my mind, I didn't feel like catching up, so I asked Julia to take me to the hospital first. On the way to the hospital, probably sensing my worry, Julia said, "Don't worry. Erick can already move around a bit. He just needs a bit more rest to recover." I glanced over at her, and she smiled at me. It was strange. The way she smiled and her polite demeanor seemed oddly familiar, as if I had seen it somewhere before. She explained some of the things I missed over the past few years in just the right amount of detail. "I met Erick a year and a half ago when I changed jobs and interviewed for an executive assistant position. Just like you. He didn't recognize me," she said, smiling before continuing. "He had already forgotten my name when he finally made me an offer." I smiled and asked if he remembered the Julia he used to sponsor in high school. The memory seemed to delight her. She smiled softly, with a nostalgic expression, her eyes and brows filled with amusement as if she couldn't help herself. She said, "You should have seen his face then. If he could have backed out of the offer without looking bad, I think he would have done it right away." I paused and glanced at her through the rearview mirror. I finally realized where that strange sense of familiarity came from. She resembled the old me. The way she mimicked my movements, my expressions, the rhythm of my speech, and even the way I smiled, it was all how I had been in high school. She replicated it perfectly. For some reason, I suddenly felt a sense of disappointment, and even pity for her. I thought of years ago, when she stood against the light like a porcupine, telling me, "Zoe, one day, I will become your rival." The rebirth I wished for her back then wasn't meant to result in who she was now. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the seat to rest. Julia glanced at me through the rearview mirror, then fell silent. Chapter 09. When I entered the hospital room, Erick was still lying on the bed, seemingly on a video call with his computer. I could hear an employee's voice from the other side of the computer reporting work. Erick looked up and saw me, his eyes lighting up. He waited until the person on the other side finished speaking before interrupting, saying, "Sorry, I've got something to take care of. I'll get back to you later." After ending the call, he closed the laptop and looked at me, smiling as warmly as ever. He said, "Zoe." My nose suddenly felt a bit sore. His arm and leg were in casts, and there were still unhealed bruises on his face. I walked over, and he was half lying on the bed. I wasn't sure what to do. Julia came in behind me. She was clearly accustomed to doing these things. She adjusted the bed, walked to the side, checked the cup on the nightstand, then poured half a cup of water from the kettle beside her. Finally, she looked at the medicine on the nightstand, picked out 3 kinds, and handed them to Erick, saying, "Erick, take your medicine." Erick took them habitually. This must have happened countless times during the past weeks he'd been in the hospital, which explained their seamless coordination. After Erick took the medicine, Julia looked up at me, her smile almost like a challenge, and then asked, "Miss Zoe, would you like some fruit?" I didn't answer, but Erick did. His tone was polite but distant as he said, "No need. You can head back to the office." Julia glanced at me, then lowered her head and left. Erick and I talked for a while. I had been on the plane for over 20 hours, and after landing, I rushed straight to see him. It wasn't until now, seeing him safe and sound, that I felt at ease. I leaned on the edge of Erick's bed, and before I knew it, I fell asleep while we were talking. When I woke up, Erick was still looking at me. I had his coat draped over me, and he was holding my hand. I looked at him in a daze and then said, "Erick, I'm planning to come back." He was startled and surprised, saying, "Come back? Zoe, you don't have to do it for me." If it's what you want to do, you should know that I will always support you. I couldn't help but laugh. What are you thinking? Of course. I wouldn't give up what I love. I squeezed his hand tightly. I started an animal rescue foundation. You know, raising funds requires someone in the country to promote it. I'm not giving up what I love, nor am I abandoning those animals. I just found another way to achieve my dream. Erick, who says you have to stay in Africa forever to help those animals? Erick stared at me, stunned. I smiled at him and then said, I've always worked hard. Erick, you're so good. And I am Zoe. Also Mrs. Erick. What I want to do and my love for you have never conflicted. This was the first time I saw Erick's eyes turn slightly red. He looked at me, stunned, then suddenly laughed. He said, Zoe. I held his hand tightly and said, I'm here. I stayed for a while longer. Erick still needed rest, so I decided to leave and get some things sorted out. When I left the hospital room, I was surprised to find Julia still sitting on the bench outside. Who knows how much of the conversation inside she had overheard. She looked up at me with an unreadable expression and said, Do you want to have dinner together? She looked at me, then added, Consider it a return for that meal you treated me to years ago. I couldn't help but laugh. Julia took me out for steak. She was now so familiar with the process, no more harsh screeching sound of a knife against the plate. She had adapted well to this dazzling world, far better than I had expected. But I knew she didn't invite me just for dinner. Sure enough, after a few rounds of food, she finally spoke up, her tone different from the provocation in the hospital, now filled with self-mockery. Zoe, back in high school, I was like a rat in the gutter, secretly watching you. I envied you deeply. I was jealous. And yet I felt this unconscious inferiority. In college, I recalled your every move, imitating you bit by bit until I became a despicable, second-rate version of you. Julia lifted her head and gave me a small smile. I wanted to transform, to become excellent, even if I could only capture a shadow of your demeanor. I kept working hard to get closer to you. But then, they all said you were crazy. You went all the way to impoverished Africa to become an animal protection volunteer. At that time, part of me thought you were crazy, and another part of me thought it was a great opportunity. I approached Erick, thinking that after all my changes, I might finally get close to him. Have you heard the song Lightbulb? It has a line that goes, I deliberately play the light bulb, hoping that one day, when they're done, I can take over. I admit I'm someone who tried to take advantage of a vulnerable situation, willing to become the despised third party if it meant Erick would notice me. She laughed again, a mocking smile on her face. But no matter how much I hinted or accompanied him, how readily I came when called, he always ignored me. I could never understand where the firm mutual choice and trust between the two of you came from, and it made me hate you even more. I listened quietly without interrupting, because I realized that what I longed for, what I would trade my entire life to have, you were willing to throw away for a bunch of unrelated, distant animals. Do you know how Erick got into the car accident? He worked late into the night for months, trying to free up a month-long break to go to Africa to be with you. Finally, she said, maybe take me there sometime. I want to see that savannah you're protecting. They all say what you're defending is a joke. I want to see exactly what joke I lost to. I looked at her, and she suddenly smiled, a smile that wasn't a deliberate imitation of mine but seemed more like her true self. With all its sarcasm and thorns, she said, Do you think I'm shameless, daring to make such a bold request? She continued, calmly, But you owe me. I took care of Erick for more than half a month. Let's call it a favor repaid. Chapter 10. Long after everything happened, I often wondered if Julia coming with me to Africa was a blessing or a curse for her. After confirming that Erick was fine, I prepared to fly back to Africa to handle some of the foundation's unfinished business. As fate would have it, after wrapping things up, I decided to take a trip to Virunga National Park in Congo. It's the oldest ecological reserve in Africa, spanning over 2 million acres, home to more than 2,000 plant species, 700 bird species, and 218 mammal species. But in the last 20 years, Rwanda's long civil war had turned this once paradise of flora and fauna into a hellish place. Armed groups plundered the park's wildlife, and since 1996, Over 152 park rangers have been killed in recent years due to strict conservation efforts. Such poaching incidents had significantly decreased, and they no longer happened openly during the day. Julia insisted on coming with me. Perhaps it was fate, but Julia and I ended up in the middle of a shooting when a poacher fired in our direction. Julia pushed me down to the ground. That bullet hit her abdomen, and blood quickly spread. She lay flat on the ground, staring at the sky, with tears streaming down her cheeks. In the end, she looked at me and asked, "Zoe, am I going to die?" As I administered first aid and bandaged her wounds, while also contacting the nearby team, I said calmly, "No, in Africa, strict measures are taken to control poaching. These scattered poachers don't have proper guns or ammunition. Most of it is homemade, and while it's dangerous, the wounds are not fatal if treated in time." But if she hadn't pushed me down, that shot would have been aimed at my head. Even if I had survived, I likely would have ended up a vegetable or paralyzed. Julia, however, seemed to think I was lying to comfort her. Before passing out, she smiled at me and said, "Maybe it's for the best, Zoe." I coveted Erick, but now, I owe you nothing. The next evening, as Julia lay in the hospital, awake and receiving N4, she stared at the drip without saying a word. I stayed by her bedside. It seemed like she had given up, no longer trying to fight or put up a facade. With a cold expression, she said to me, "Let's just pretend what happened today, and everything I said to you never happened, okay?" Trying not to laugh, I peeled an apple for her. "No way. You're my lifesaver. How could I just forget?" She looked utterly fed up. She was more adorable at that moment than ever before. Finally, she said to me, "Zoe, do you know why I hate you? Because I've always thought you're a hypocrite." "And now?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. "Still the same." After a long silence, she quietly added, "But I'm really thankful to you and Erick. You both gave me a new life. I'm going to live my own life now. Zoe, I won't be trying to be like you anymore. I'm just me, just Julia, and I'm great too, right?" I handed her the apple, nodded solemnly, and said, "Yes, you've always been great." That Julia who traveled a long way from a small mountain village to get into the province's top school. That Julia who showed up in front of Erick and me with 2 large woven bags. She had always been great. She smiled and closed her eyes, ready to rest. I tiptoed out of the hospital room, closing the door softly behind me. Erick, who had heard the news, was sitting in the hallway. He mouthed to me, "Is everything okay?" I nodded, and he let out a sigh of relief, then looked at me with lingering fear, afraid, I suppose, of losing me. I stood outside Julia's hospital room and looked at him. I think fate has been kind to all 3 of us. Years ago, Erick saved Julia. Years later, the fairy tale came to life, and she saved both me and Erick. Who could say this wasn't a beautiful story of redemption?